Two girls appeared at the traffic light begging for help. "Our mom is sick." The millionaire almost drove on until he saw the photo one of them was carrying. In that instant, his world stopped. He knew that face. And when he entered that humble home, he discovered a past that was never buried. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The red traffic light blinked impatiently on Park Avenue when Edward stopped his black BMW at the intersection. It was 8:15 on a regular Tuesday morning, and he was already late for the meeting that would define the future of his development company. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel as he observed the morning movement of the city through the tinted windows. It was then that two girls appeared out of nowhere, running toward his car. The older one, who looked about 12, knocked on the driver's window with an urgency that made Edward hesitate before opening it. She had disheveled brown hair and dark eyes full of tears. The younger one, perhaps 8 years old, firmly held her sister's hand, visibly trembling. "Please, sir, our mother needs help," shouted the older one through the glass. "She can't get out of bed." Edward lowered the window just a few inches, maintaining the caution that years of urban living had taught him. "Call an ambulance, girls. Dial 911. "We already tried." The girl's voice was laden with desperation. "They said it would take hours because it's not an emergency. But she's really bad, sir. Please." The younger of the sisters moved closer, holding a crumpled photo between her small fingers. "Look, mister, this is our mum. She needs this medicine here." She extended a paper with a name written on it that Edward couldn't completely decipher. Edward looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. 8:17. The meeting was at 9, and he still needed to review the latest figures for the project. But when his eyes returned to the photograph in the little girl's hand, something strange happened. The world around him seemed to grow quieter, as if the noise of traffic had been muffled by an invisible curtain. That face in the photo. There was something familiar there. The delicate features, the shape of the eyes, the subtle curve of the smile. A strange sensation took hold of his chest, as if a door long locked had been cracked open, letting escape memories that he had buried deeply. "What's your mother's name?" he asked, surprising himself with his own question. "Helen," answered the older one, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "Helen Rogers." The name echoed in his mind like a distant echo. Helen. How many years had passed? 10? 12? Edward closed his eyes for a second, trying to organize the thoughts that jumbled in his head like pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle. Helen with the green eyes and shy smile. Helen who disappeared from his life without explanation, without goodbye, without a single word. One night she was there in his apartment, talking about plans and dreams, and the next morning she had vanished, leaving only a note saying she needed to leave. "Where do you live?" The question came out before he could think better of it. "In Brooklyn Heights, sir. It's not far from here. Please, can you help us?" The plea in the older girl's voice cut through his defenses like a sharp blade. Edward looked at the traffic light, which had been green for several seconds. The cars behind had started honking impatiently. He should drive on, go to his meeting, take care of his business. That's what he always did. That's what Edward Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Developments, should do. But that's not what happened. He turned on his signal and pulled out of the line of cars parking on the shoulder. "Get in," he said, unlocking the rear doors. "Let's go to your mother." The girls looked at each other for a second, as if they couldn't believe someone had finally answered their plea. Then they quickly got into the car, the younger one whispering an almost inaudible "thank you." During the drive through the streets of Brooklyn Heights, Edward couldn't stop thinking about the coincidence. Or was it a coincidence? The two girls in the back seat were whispering to each other, but he caught stray words: mum, medicine, money. The younger one had darker hair than her sister, and when she turned to give directions, Edward noticed she had the same dark eyes that he saw in the mirror every morning. "It's here, sir," said the older one, pointing to a narrow street with simple, colorful houses. Edward parked in front of a yellow house with white bars on the windows. The front garden was small but well kept, with some flowers that insisted on growing despite adverse conditions. The girls got out quickly and ran to the door, turning to make sure he was following them. Inside, the house was clean and organized, but Edward could see the signs of financial difficulty. Old but well-preserved furniture, walls that needed a new coat of paint, objects that told the story of a family struggling to maintain dignity despite the circumstances. "She's in the bedroom," said the older one, guiding him down a narrow hallway. Edward hesitated at the bedroom door. 12 years. It had been 12 years since he'd seen Helen, and now she was there, just a few feet away. What would he say? What would she say? How would she react to seeing him? He entered the room and saw her. Helen was lying in bed, pale and with irregular breathing. Even with her face marked by time and fatigue, it was unmistakably her. The same brown hair, now longer and with some grey strands, framed a face that bore the marks of a life lived intensely. "Mom," whispered the younger one, approaching the bed. "We brought someone to help." Edward approached slowly, his heart beating as if it would leap from his chest. Helen opened her eyes slowly, and when she recognized him, an expression of disbelief took over her face. "Edward?" Her voice was weak, almost a whisper. "No, it can't be." "Hi, Helen." He didn't know what else to say. 12 years of separation, and all he could manage was a simple greeting. She tried to sit up, but didn't have the strength. "How did you... Why are you here?" "Your daughters asked me for help," he replied, taking his phone from his pocket. "I'm going to call a private ambulance. You're going to get the best care possible." "Edward, I can't pay..." Helen began, but he interrupted her with a gentle gesture. "Don't worry about that now. Let's take care of your health first." While making the necessary calls, Edward observed the two girls. The older one had stayed beside the bed, holding her mother's hand, while the younger one kept a little distance, watching everything with curious and still frightened eyes. There was something about the younger one that disturbed him. It wasn't just the dark eyes or the shape of her face. It was something more subtle, deeper. The way she tilted her head when thinking, the way she bit her lower lip when nervous. Gestures that he recognized because he saw them in himself every day. The ambulance arrived in 15 minutes. Efficient paramedics quickly examined Helen and confirmed that she needed immediate hospital care. Severe dehydration, low blood pressure, signs of malnutrition. "We'll take her to Mount Sinai Hospital," informed one of the paramedics. "Are you a relative?" Edward hesitated. I'm a family friend." During transport to the hospital, he followed the ambulance in his car with the two girls in the back seat. The older one introduced herself as Amy and the younger one as Betty. They told him their mother had been feeling ill for days, but didn't want to go to the doctor because they had no money. "She always says she'll get better," explained Amy, "but this morning she couldn't even get up to give us breakfast." "That's why we went out to ask for help," added Betty. "You're the first one who stopped to listen to us." Edward felt a lump in his throat. How many people had passed by those girls that morning? How many opportunities to help had been wasted? And why had he, of all people, been the one chosen to stop? At the hospital, Helen was quickly attended to and admitted for observation. The doctors confirmed that she was out of danger, but would need a few days of rest and proper medication. Edward took care of all the administrative procedures, ignoring the curious looks from the nurses, when he signed as the financially responsible party. It was only when Helen was stabilized and sleeping that he finally had time to process what was happening. He was in the hospital corridor, watching through the half-open door two girls who might be his daughters, taking care of a woman he had loved more than a decade ago. Amy approached him in the hallway. "Mr. Edward?" She had heard the name when her mother recognized him. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how we're going to pay..." "Don't worry about that," he said, but his mind was elsewhere. He was calculating ages, recalling dates, trying to fit together the pieces of a puzzle that might change his life forever. Amy was 12 years old. If Helen was pregnant when she disappeared, the timing matched. And Betty, with her 8 years and eyes identical to his, she was born about 4 years after Helen vanished from his life. But that would mean they had met again. When? Why couldn't he remember? "Amy," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "do you remember your father?" The girl looked at the floor. "I never met my father. My mom always said he was an important person, that he had other commitments." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. "And Betty?" "Betty doesn't know her father either. Mom says that, well, she says that important men don't have time for families like ours." Amy's words echoed in the empty hospital corridor like a sentence. Edward remembered the meeting he had missed, the business he had left behind, all the life he had built based on commitments, goals, and responsibilities that now seemed so small in the face of this revelation. He looked at Betty, who was sleeping in a chair next to her mother's room door. Even while sleeping, she kept one hand extended toward the room, as if she wanted to make sure her mother was still there. Edward sat down next to Amy, and for the first time in years didn't know what to do. His entire life had been planned, controlled, predictable. Now, in a matter of hours, everything he thought he knew about himself had been questioned. "Amy," he said softly, so as not to wake Betty, "when your mother gets better, we're going to have a very important conversation about the past, about you two, about many things." The girl looked at him with curiosity but simply nodded. There was a maturity in her eyes that shouldn't exist in a 12-year-old child, the forced maturity of someone who had grown up assuming responsibilities beyond her age. Edward stayed at the hospital until Helen woke up late in the afternoon. When she opened her eyes and saw him there sitting in the chair next to the bed, a weak but genuine smile appeared on her face. "For you stayed," she said, as if she couldn't believe it. "I stayed." He leaned forward. "Helen, we need to talk. About many things." She nodded, but Edward could see the fatigue in her eyes. "Not today," she whispered. "Today I just want to thank you for saving my life and the lives of my daughters." Our daughters, thought Edward, but said nothing. There would be time for those conversations. There would be time to discover the whole truth. For now it was enough to know that he had made the right decision by following those two girls. It was enough to know that, for once, he had put something more important than his business first. When he finally left the hospital, it was already night. The girls stayed with a nurse he had specially hired to look after them. As he drove back home, Edward couldn't stop thinking about how an ordinary morning had transformed into the morning that changed his life forever. He didn't yet know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would lead him to question everything he had built, everything he believed was important, and everything he thought he knew about the meaning of the word family. 3 days later, Edward was sitting in the same hospital chair where he had spent the previous night. Helen was much better now. The doctors had confirmed she would be discharged in the morning, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. There was something magnetic about that place, as if his entire previous life had been merely preparation for this moment. Amy and Betty were also in the room, organizing the few things their mother had brought. Over the past few days, Edward had observed how they cared for Helen with a dedication that touched his heart. They were children forced to grow up too quickly, taking on responsibilities that should belong to adults. "Edward," Helen said softly, interrupting his thoughts, "could we have a moment alone?" The girls left to get a snack in the hospital cafeteria, leaving the two of them alone for the first time since their reunion. The silence that settled in the room was laden with 12 years of unanswered questions. "Why did you disappear?" The question came out more directly than Edward had intended. "One night you were there with me in the apartment, making plans for the weekend, and the next day you had vanished without explanation." Helen closed her eyes, as if the question physically hurt her. "I tried to talk to you, Edward. I tried several times." "What do you mean you tried? I never received any call, never." "You think I didn't try?" Helen's voice was laden with an old pain. "I called your office every day for 2 weeks. Your secretary always said you were in a meeting, that you were traveling, that you couldn't take the call." Edward frowned. He didn't remember any calls from Helen. That doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't she pass them? Because someone gave instructions for her not to pass them. Helen looked him directly in the eyes. "Someone who didn't want me to talk to you." Who? Who would do that?" Helen sighed deeply. "Your mother, Edward. Mrs. Meredith showed up at my house a week after you returned from that business trip to Chicago. She knew everything about us, knew where I lived, where I worked. She offered me money to disappear from your life." Edward felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. "My mother? That's impossible. She would never..." "She said you had a brilliant future ahead of you, that you were going to take over your father's company, that a woman like me would only get in the way of your plans." Tears began to run down Helen's face. "She said that if I truly loved you, I should let you follow your destiny without ties." "And you believed her?" Edward was incredulous. "You believed that's what I thought?" "I was pregnant, Edward." The confession came out as a whisper. "I was 2 months pregnant when she showed up at my door. I had planned to tell you that weekend, but you traveled, and when you got back, she had already spoken to me." Edward's world completely collapsed. Amy was his daughter, and he had lost 12 years of her life because of a manipulation he didn't even know had happened. "Why didn't you insist? Why didn't you come find me in person?" "Because I was young and scared," Helen answered, wiping away tears. "Because your mother showed me photos of you with another woman. said you were already committed to someone of your social class, because she convinced me that I would just be a burden in your life." Edward got up from the chair and began pacing back and forth in the small room. His mind worked feverishly, trying to fit together the pieces of this devastating revelation. His mother had always been controlling, had always tried to direct his life, but he never imagined she would go to such lengths. "And what about Betty?" he asked, stopping suddenly. "Is she also—" Helen hesitated, and in that hesitation, Edward found his answer. "We met once, a few years later," she said quietly. "You were leaving a restaurant downtown. I was passing by chance, coming back from work. You seemed so different, so distant that I almost didn't recognize you." Edward tried to remember. 4 years after Helen disappeared, 2016, maybe 2017, he vaguely remembered a casual encounter, someone who had called him by name on the street. "You were in a hurry," Helen continued. "You said you had an important meeting, but asked me to have a quick coffee. We talked about the past, about how things had changed. You seemed lonely. And you didn't tell me about Amy. How could I? You barely had time to talk to me, let alone to know you had a daughter." Helen wiped her eyes again. "But that night we were both so alone, so lost. One thing led to another, and 9 months later, Betty was born." "Betty was born," Helen confirmed. "And this time I didn't even try to contact you. I had learned to live alone, to take care of Amy alone. I thought it would be better that way." Edward sat heavily in the chair. 2 daughters. He had 2 daughters and didn't know. He had missed the first steps, the first words, the first days of school, the first falls, the first tears, the first joys. "Why now?" he asked. "Why tell me this now?" "Because they deserve to have a father," Helen answered without hesitation. "Because I almost died a few days ago and realized that if something happens to me, they'll be completely alone. Because I'm tired of lying to them when they ask about their father." "And you think I'm just going to walk into their lives like this, after all these years?" Helen looked at him with an intensity he hadn't expected. "I don't think anything, Edward. I'm giving you a chance to be the father they never had, to be the man I thought you were 12 years ago." "A chance with conditions?" Edward realized there was more behind those words. "A chance with one condition," Helen confirmed. "You have 1 month. 1 month for what?" "1 month to prove to me that you've changed, that you're no longer that man who lives only for business, who has no time for anything beyond meetings and corporate commitments." Helen sat up in bed, looking him directly in the eyes. "1 month to prove that you can be a real father." Edward laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh. "And how exactly do I prove that? By living with us, by really getting to know your daughters, by being present in their lives in a way you never were in mine." Helen paused. "If after a month you can convince me that you really want to be part of our family, I'll let you. If you can't, you disappear from our lives forever and never bother us again." "That's emotional blackmail. That's maternal protection," Helen responded firmly. "I won't let you enter their lives only to discover later that you don't have time to be a father. They've suffered enough with your absence. I won't let them suffer another disappointment." Edward was silent for a few minutes, processing the proposal. 1 month. 30 days to prove he could be a father when he didn't even really know what that meant. 30 days to win back a family he didn't know existed. "And what happens to my current life?" he asked. "My company, my commitments, my routine?" "That's the question, Edward." Helen smiled sadly. "If you're still worried about those things, then you already have your answer." At that moment, Amy and Betty returned to the room, bringing a sandwich for their mother and chatting animatedly about something they had seen on the cafeteria TV. When they entered, Edward observed them with completely different eyes. Amy, at 12, already had defined features that resembled both him and Helen. She was a serious girl, responsible beyond her years, but when she smiled, she lit up the entire room. Betty, smaller and more spontaneous, had a contagious energy that filled any space she occupied. His daughters. These were his daughters. "Mr. Edward," Betty approached him with the natural ease of children. "Is Mom leaving the hospital today?" "Yes, she is. The doctors said she's much better." "And are you going back to your important house?" The question came out with an innocence that cut Edward's heart. He looked at Helen, who was watching him carefully, waiting for his answer. He looked at Amy, who pretended not to be paying attention, but was clearly listening to every word. He looked at Betty, with her dark eyes identical to his, waiting for a simple answer to a question that would change the course of all their lives. "No," Edward said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I'm not going back to my important house, at least not for the next 30 days. "Why?" Betty asked, curious. Edward knelt down to be at the girl's height. "Because I have much more important things to do for the next 30 days. I have 2 very special girls to get to know better." Betty smiled, and in that smile, Edward saw a bit of himself, a bit of Helen, and a lot of a child who deserved to have a father present in her life. Amy, however, didn't seem so convinced. And after the 30 days, "Will you leave?" Amy's question was loaded with a distrust that spoke louder than her age. It was the question of someone who had already learned that adults make promises they don't always keep. "I don't know, Amy," Edward answered honestly. "That depends on many things, but I promise you one thing. During these 30 days, I'll be here. Completely here." "Completely here how?" The girl wasn't willing to accept vague answers. Edward looked at Helen, who nodded encouragingly. "Completely here means I'll take you to school and pick you up. It means I'll help you with your homework. It means that when you need something, I'll be around." "Like a real dad?" Betty asked, and her voice was full of a hope that made Edward's heart clench. "Like a real dad," he confirmed. That afternoon, when Helen was discharged from the hospital, Edward took them home. But as he drove through the familiar streets of Brooklyn Heights, he knew he wasn't just taking them home. He was heading toward a new life, a life he didn't even know he wanted until that moment. While Helen settled back into her room and the girls organized their things, Edward found himself alone in the small living room of the yellow house, looking around and trying to imagine what it would be like to live there for the next 30 days. For the first time in years, Edward Mitchell didn't know exactly what to do. There were no spreadsheets to consult, charts to analyze, reports to review. There was only a family he needed to get to know, and a chance to become someone he had never been before. Someone who put love above business. Someone who knew there were things more important than meetings and corporate commitments. Someone who could be called a father. The first week was a complete disaster. Edward woke up at 6 in the morning, as he had always done. But instead of reviewing financial reports while drinking his espresso, he found himself trying to figure out how to make pancakes for 2 girls who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Dad?" Betty had started calling him that on the 3rd day, with the natural ease of children who accept changes more easily than adults. "The pancakes are burned again." Amy, sitting at the small kitchen table, didn't disguise her amused smile. She still called him Mr. Edward, maintaining a respectful but affectionate distance. "Maybe it's better to just make toast," she suggested diplomatically. Edward looked at the frying pan where his culinary attempts lay carbonized and sighed. In 12 years building a real estate empire, he had learned to negotiate million-dollar contracts, to analyze complex markets, to make decisions that affected hundreds of employees. But making breakfast for 2 children was proving to be a much greater challenge than any business he had ever closed. "I'll call the restaurant on the corner," he said, reaching for his cell phone. "You can't," Amy said quickly. "Mom said you have to learn to do household things. It's part of the test." Edward put away the phone and looked at the girls. Helen was in the bedroom, still recovering from the days in the hospital, but he knew she was watching everything closely. Every gesture of his, every word, every reaction was being evaluated. "All right," he said, dumping the burned batter in the trash. "Let's try again." This time, with Amy giving precise instructions about fire temperature and cooking time, he managed to make pancakes that were at least edible. They weren't the best pancakes in the world, but when he saw Betty's proud smile as she took the first bite, Edward felt a satisfaction he had never experienced in any business meeting. Taking the girls to school proved to be another unexpected challenge. Edward was used to moving around the city in his air-conditioned BMW with tinted windows, but Amy and Betty attended different schools at different times, and both were a considerable distance from the house. "Mom always took the bus with us," Amy explained when she saw him hesitating at the door. She said it was an adventure. Edward looked at the bus stop full of people waiting, at the line that was forming, at the morning movement of the city that he only knew from inside chauffeur-driven cars. His first reaction was to suggest they take a taxi, but something in Amy's expectant expression made him change his mind. "Then let's take the bus," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The trip was a revelation. Sitting on the bus seat, with Betty beside him chattering about the new teacher and Amy on the other side reading a book for a test. Edward observed the city waking up from a completely different perspective. He saw people going to work, children going to school, real life happening around him in a way he had forgotten existed. "Mr. Edward," Amy said, closing her book for a moment, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you never look for us before?" "I mean, if you're our father." The question he knew would come sooner or later had finally arrived. Edward looked at Amy, saw the genuine curiosity mixed with a touch of hurt in her eyes, and decided she deserved the truth. "Because I didn't know you existed," he answered simply. "Your mother never managed to tell me, and I was too foolish to notice." "But when Betty was born, you already knew Mom again," Amy insisted. She was intelligent and wasn't willing to accept half-truths. Edward sighed. "When your sister was born, I was so lost in my own life that I didn't realize what was happening in the lives of people who were important to me. I thought that working hard and making a lot of money was the most important thing in the world. And now you don't think that anymore?" Edward looked at Betty, who had stopped chattering and was listening to the conversation attentively. He looked at Amy, waiting for his answer with the seriousness of someone who had already learned that adults' words don't always match their actions. "Now I'm learning that there are more important things," he said, "like taking you two to school by bus on a Thursday morning." Amy smiled. It wasn't a complete smile, there were still guards that needed to be lowered, but it was a start. The days that followed were a mixture of small victories and great revelations. Edward discovered that Amy loved math but hated English, that she dreamed of being an engineer like him, that she had a sharp intelligence and an impressive maturity for her age. He discovered that Betty was a natural artist who drew entire stories in notebooks she kept under her bed, who had a contagious sense of humor and an incredible ability to find joy in the smallest things. But he also discovered the weight of the responsibilities they carried. One afternoon, arriving home early from school, he found Amy teaching Betty how to do her homework, cooking lunch, and still trying to take care of Helen, who had had a more difficult day. "Amy, you don't need to do all this," he said, taking the wooden spoon from her hands. "Let me finish lunch." "Mom can't make an effort yet," Amy replied, but Edward noticed the relief in her voice. "And Betty doesn't know how to cook. And you shouldn't know either," Edward responded softly. "You should be playing, studying, being a child." "Someone needs to take care of the family," Amy said, and there was a sadness in her voice that made Edward's heart clench. That night, after the girls went to sleep, Edward sat beside Helen's bed to talk. "She grew up too fast," Helen said, following Edward's gaze toward the girls' room. "When I started having health problems last year, she took on responsibilities she shouldn't have." "Why didn't you look for me?" Edward asked. "Even with all the problems of the past, even with the hurt, why didn't you look for me when things got difficult?" Helen was silent for a moment, looking at her own hands. "Pride," she finally admitted. "Fear, and also because I didn't know if you would want to know." "Helen," Edward began, but she interrupted him. "You have to understand, Edward. For all these years I raised these girls alone. I worked 2 jobs, went to college at night, fought to give them a dignified life. And even in the most difficult moments, I never let them feel the lack of anything essential, but you let them feel the lack of a father." The words came out harsher than Edward intended, and he saw Helen close her eyes as if she had been physically struck. "I know," she whispered, "and that's why I'm giving you this chance now. Because they deserve to have a father, even if it's late." Edward took Helen's hand between his. "It's not late. It may be different than what it could have been, but it's not late." It was on that night that Edward made a decision that would change not just the next 30 days, but the rest of his life. He called his partner and best friend, Robert, and asked him to temporarily take over the presidency of the company. "Temporarily for how long?" Robert asked, clearly confused. "I don't know. It could be a month. It could be forever." "Edward, are you okay? This doesn't sound like you." "That's exactly the problem, Robert. This sounds too much like me, or at least who I was." Edward looked out the living room window, seeing the light still on in the girls' room. "I need to find out who I can be." The second week brought new challenges. Edward had temporarily moved to Helen's living room sofa, determined to be present full-time in the girls' lives. But his constant presence also brought to light tensions that had been masked by the novelty of the first days. Amy began to test him in more direct ways. She came home late from school without giving explanations, openly questioned his decisions, challenged his authority in ways that made it clear she still didn't fully accept him as a father. "You can't tell me to do that," she said one afternoon, when Edward asked her to organize the room she shared with Betty. "You're not my real dad yet." The words hit Edward like an arrow. He saw Helen in the kitchen doorway, observing the interaction, and realized this was also part of the test. How would he react when challenged? How would he handle the natural resistance of a child who had learned to protect herself emotionally? "You're right," Edward said, sitting on the messy bed. "I'm not your real dad yet, but I'm trying to be." Amy looked at him surprised. She had expected an argument, an imposition of authority, not an admission of vulnerability. "Trying how?" she asked, but her voice was less hostile. "Learning to be the kind of person who deserves to be called a father," Edward replied. "Learning that being a father isn't just giving orders or paying the bills, it's being present, it's listening, it's caring." Amy was silent for a moment, processing his words. "And if you can't learn?" The question was loaded with fear. Fear of another disappointment. Fear of opening her heart to someone who might leave. "Then I'll keep trying until I can," Edward said. "Because you two are worth the effort." It was in this conversation that something changed between them. Amy didn't start calling him Dad immediately, but the active resistance transformed into a cautious curiosity. She began to observe him more, to test his limits in less hostile ways, to gradually include him in her routine. Betty, on the other hand, had adapted to Edward's presence with an ease that sometimes surprised him. She had started waiting for him to wake up to have breakfast together, asked for help with homework even when she didn't need it, and had developed the habit of sitting next to him on the sofa every evening to tell him about her day. "Dad," she said one night, while Edward was helping her brush her teeth, "are you going to stay here forever?" The simple question carried an enormous weight. Edward knew that Betty was getting attached to him, that she was building expectations and dreams around his presence. He also knew that if he failed Helen's test, Betty would be the one who would suffer most from his departure. "I want to stay, Betty," he answered honestly. "But that depends on many things. Depends on Mom. It depends on me proving that I can be a good father to you two." Betty thought about this for a moment, with the seriousness that sometimes takes over children when they are processing adult concepts. "You're already a good dad," she finally said. "You make burned pancakes, but with love." Edward laughed, but felt his eyes filling with tears. "Burned pancakes with love. I think I can work with that." At the end of the second week, Edward realized he had started to think differently. When his cell phone rang with calls from the office, he no longer felt the urgent anxiety to answer immediately. When he saw financial reports that Robert sent by email, he read them with the detachment of someone observing another person's life. But when Amy got a good grade in math and ran to show him first, when Betty drew a portrait of the family where he appeared next to Helen and the two girls, when Helen smiled seeing him helping their daughters with homework, Edward felt a satisfaction that no successful business had ever provided him. He was transforming into someone he didn't know he could be. And for the first time in his adult life, this transformation didn't scare him. It moved him. The third week began with an unexpected visit that would change everything. Edward was in the kitchen preparing the girls' breakfast when the doorbell rang. It was Sunday morning, and they had planned to spend the entire day together, perhaps go to the park that Betty so wanted to visit. When Edward opened the door, he found his mother, Meredith Mitchell, impeccably dressed even for an unannounced morning visit. Her eyes quickly scanned the simple environment of the yellow house, and Edward could see the discomfort in her expression. "Edward, I need to talk to you," she said, entering without being invited. "Alone." "Good morning to you too, Mother." Edward closed the door but made no move to take her to another room. "Anything you have to say can be said here." "Edward, what are you doing?" Meredith looked around with barely disguised disapproval. "Robert told me you abandoned the company, that you're living in this place. Is this some kind of midlife crisis?" "This is me discovering that I have two daughters I never knew," Edward replied calmly, but his voice carried a coldness that his mother knew well. Meredith's face paled slightly. "Edward, you knew, didn't you?" Edward's voice was low, controlled, but there was an intensity in it that made his mother step back. "You knew Helen was pregnant when you made her disappear from my life." "I protected you," Meredith said defensively. "That woman was going to ruin your future. She was going to tie you to a life of mediocrity." "Mediocrity?" Edward laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh. Mother, you deprived me of knowing my own daughters. You made them grow up without a father, because you decided that my life was worth more than their happiness. It was at this moment that Amy appeared in the living room, still in pajamas, followed by Betty. They had heard raised voices and came to investigate. Meredith looked at the two girls with an expression that mixed curiosity and discomfort. "Are these the girls?" she asked, as if evaluating a dubious investment. "These are your granddaughters," Edward corrected firmly. "Amy and Betty." Amy, with her sharp perception, immediately caught the tension in the room. "Mr. Edward, is everything okay?" "Yes, dear." Edward moved closer to the girls. "This is my mother, Grandma Meredith. She came to visit us." Betty, always more open, smiled at the unknown grandmother. "Hi, Grandma. Do you want to have breakfast with us? Dad makes really good pancakes now." Betty's innocent comment, calling him Dad, made something move in Edward's chest, but he also saw how the word Dad sounded strange to Meredith's ears. "I can't stay," Meredith said quickly. "Edward, I need to speak with you in private." "Girls, go wake up your mother," Edward said gently. "Tell her we have a visitor." When they were alone, Meredith wasted no time. "Edward, you can't be serious. Abandoning everything you've built for two children you barely know? They're not just any children, they're my daughters. How can you be sure? This woman could be taking advantage of your goodwill. People like her—" "People like her?" Edward interrupted, and for the first time his voice rose. "What kind of person is Helen, Mother? Because from what I've seen, she's a woman who raised two extraordinary girls alone, who worked double to give them dignity, who even when sick never let them feel a lack of love." "Edward, be realistic. You have a company to run, a future to build. You can't throw all that away on an emotional impulse." It was at this moment that Helen appeared in the living room, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to face the situation. She wore a simple robe, but there was a dignity in her posture that made Edward proud. "Meredith," Helen said simply. "Helen." Meredith's response was icy. "I see you finally got what you wanted." "What I wanted?" Helen laughed bitterly. "What I wanted was for my older daughter to know her father. What I wanted was not to have to explain to them why they didn't have a father figure. What I wanted was not to need your help or anyone else's. And now you're taking advantage of my son's generosity. Enough." Edward positioned himself between the two women. "Mother, you're going to leave my house now." "Your house?" Meredith looked around with disdain. "Edward, this is not your house. Your house is the apartment on the Upper East Side. Your life is the company your father built. My life is what I choose it to be," Edward interrupted. "And I choose these girls. I choose this family." Meredith was silent for a moment, clearly shocked by the firmness in her son's voice. "Edward, if you follow this path, there will be no turning back. The company needs you. Your inheritance, your social position can keep it all," Edward said without hesitation. "The company, the inheritance, the social position. None of that is worth two girls who call me Dad." It was at this moment that Amy and Betty returned to the living room, clearly having heard part of the conversation. Amy approached Edward and for the first time took his hand. "Mr. Edward," she said, and her voice was firm despite her age. "If this lady is your mother, then she's our grandmother. But if she doesn't want you to stay with us, then maybe she's not the kind of grandmother we need." Amy's words, spoken with the brutal honesty of children, echoed in the room like a final verdict. Meredith looked at her granddaughter, then at Edward, then at Helen. "You'll regret this," she said finally. "All of you." "Maybe," Edward replied, "but it will be our choice to regret." After Meredith left, the house was silent for a few minutes. The girls cuddled on the sofa with Helen, clearly shaken by the morning's tension. Edward sat in the armchair across from them, trying to process everything that had happened. "Did you really give up everything?" Helen asked softly. "I didn't give up anything," Edward replied. "I chose what was more important." "And you're not afraid?" Edward looked at Amy, who was watching him with a new intensity, as if finally seeing him for real. He looked at Betty, who had gotten up and come to sit on the arm of his chair. He looked at Helen, who for the first time since they reunited seemed to be really seeing the man he had become. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to build a family. I don't know how to live without the structure I've known for decades." "Then why did you stay?" Amy asked. Edward thought for a moment, searching for the right words. Because for the first time in my life, I woke up in the morning excited to see what the day would bring. Because when you two smile at me, I feel like I'm a better person than I thought I could be. Because when your mother looks at me, I see the man I always wanted to be but never knew how. Betty hugged his neck. So you'll stay forever? If you'll let me, Edward replied, looking at Helen. If I pass the test. Helen stood up from the sofa and approached the armchair where Edward sat with Betty in his lap. The test ended a week ago, she said softly. How? The test was to see if you would be able to put anything above your business, above your previous life. You just gave up $1 million inheritance for 2 girls you met 3 weeks ago. Helen smiled, and it was the first completely happy smile that Edward had seen on her face since they reunited. I think I can consider that you passed. Does that mean Dad's staying? Betty asked, looking from her mother to Edward. It means, Helen said, that if he wants, we're going to build a real family. Edward stood up, still with Betty in his arms, and extended his free hand to Amy. What do you think? Do you want to try to build a family with me? Amy hesitated for only a second before taking his hand. You might not be perfect. I'm definitely not. And you might still burn the pancakes sometimes, probably always. But you stayed, Amy said, and her voice was full of an emotion she was still learning to express. Even when your mother said you would lose everything, you stayed. And I'll keep staying, Edward promised. That afternoon, they went to the park that Betty had so wanted to visit. Edward pushed the girls on the swings and discovered that laughing with them was better than any business victory. Helen sat on a nearby bench, observing and smiling, and when Edward sat down beside her, she naturally took his hand. It won't be easy, she said, building a family after so much time. I know, Edward interlaced his fingers with hers, but I learned one thing in these 3 weeks. What? That the best things in life aren't easy. They're necessary. 2 weeks later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Edward proposed to Helen. It wasn't an elaborate or pompous proposal. He was simply helping her in the kitchen, preparing lunch while the girls did homework at the living room table, when he realized this was what he wanted for the rest of his life. Helen, he said, stopping chopping tomatoes, marry me. She looked at him surprised. What? Marry me, let's make this official. Let's be a real family with documents and everything. Helen laughed. Is that your idea of a romantic proposal? It's my idea of an honest proposal, Edward replied. I love you. I love our daughters. I want to wake up every day for the rest of my life trying to make pancakes that don't burn for all 3 of you. Our daughters, Helen repeated, smiling. I liked how that sounded. So? Yes, she said, moving closer to him. Yes, I want to marry you. The wedding took place 2 months later, in the backyard of the yellow house that Edward had bought for them. It was a small, intimate ceremony, with only a few close friends, and, surprisingly, Robert, who had become a beloved honorary uncle to the girls. Amy was Helen's maid of honor, wearing a light blue dress that she had chosen herself. When the judge asked if Edward took Helen as his wife, he looked at the 3 women who had completely transformed his life and said, I accept her, and I accept our family. When he asked if Helen accepted Edward as her husband, she replied, I accept the man he has become and the father he chose to be. The party was in the same backyard, with music, dancing, and a bountiful table prepared by friends from the neighborhood, who had already adopted Edward as one of their own. Betty was the flower girl, scattering rose petals along the path, with the seriousness of someone fulfilling a very important mission. When night fell and the neighborhood children had gone home, the family sat on the swing that Edward had installed in the tree at the back of the yard. Dad, Amy said. She had officially started calling him that after the wedding. Do you regret leaving your previous life? Edward looked around. The simple but love-filled house, Helen beside him wearing the white dress she had chosen from a modest downtown store, Betty sleeping in Helen's lap after a day full of emotions, Amy growing before his eyes and becoming a strong, intelligent young woman. Amy, he said, I spent 40 years of my life thinking I knew what success was. I thought it was having a lot of money, a big company, the respect of important people, but now I know I was completely wrong. So what's real success? She asked. Edward pointed to Betty sleeping peacefully. It's her trusting me so much that she falls asleep in my lap. It's you calling me Dad even after growing up without me for 12 years. It's your mother looking at me as if I were the most important man in the world, even when I'm making burned pancakes for breakfast." Amy smiled. "So you're a successful man." "I'm the most successful man in the world," Edward replied, and for the first time in his life he completely believed what he was saying. 5 years passed since that morning at the traffic light when two girls changed Edward's life forever. Amy had become a brilliant teenager, accepted to a public university to study engineering. Betty had developed her artistic talent, and her comic stories were already winning prizes in school competitions. Helen had transformed her passion for cooking into a small business that grew each month, providing home-cooked meals to offices in the area. And Edward had discovered that it was possible to be a businessman and a father at the same time, developing a small consulting business that allowed him to work from home and be present in his daughters' lives. On a Sunday afternoon, they were in the same yard where they had gotten married, now with a more mature garden and a bigger swing to accommodate the family that had grown. Edward was helping Betty with a science project when his cell phone rang. It was Robert. "Edward, you need to know something. Your mother—" "What happened?" Edward asked, stepping away to speak privately. "She's sick. Cancer. She's asking for you." Edward was silent for a moment. 5 years of distance, 5 years of hurt, 5 years of a life built without her presence. "She wants to see you," Robert continued, "and she wants to meet her granddaughters." That night, Edward talked with Helen about the call. They were in the bedroom they now shared, a simple but cozy room with photos of the girls covering every available surface. "What do you want to do?" Helen asked. "I don't know," Edward admitted. "Part of me is still hurt by her. But she's your mother," Helen completed, "and the girls' grandmother. Do you think I should take the girls to meet her?" Helen was thoughtful for a moment. "I think that decision has to be theirs too. They're old enough to understand the situation." The next day, Edward talked with Amy and Betty about the grandmother they hadn't seen in 5 years. To his surprise, it was Amy who took the initiative. "Dad, she's your mother, and even if she did wrong things in the past, maybe it's time to give her a chance to redeem herself." "And if she hasn't changed?" Betty asked. "What if she still thinks we're not good enough? Then at least we'll know we tried," Amy answered with the wisdom she had developed over the years. A week later, they went to visit Meredith in the hospital. She was visibly more fragile, but when she saw Edward enter the room, followed by Helen and the girls, her eyes filled with tears. "Edward," she said, trying to sit up in bed. "You came." "I came," he replied, maintaining a certain distance. "How are you?" "Better now that you're here." Meredith looked at the girls, who stayed close to Helen. "They've grown so much." "Grandma," Betty said softly, "are you sick?" The simple, direct question from her granddaughter broke through the defenses Meredith had kept up. "Yes, my dear. I'm very sick." "Will you get better?" Amy asked, and there was a genuine concern in her voice that surprised even herself. "I don't know," Meredith answered honestly, "but I want to use the time I have left to try to fix the mistakes I made." "What kind of mistakes?" Betty asked with the natural curiosity of children. Meredith looked at Edward, silently asking permission. He nodded. "I prevented you from knowing your father when you were little," Meredith said, "because I thought I knew what was best for him, but I was wrong." "Why did you do that?" Amy asked.